On a crisp autumn morning, the streets of London buzzed with energy. Tourists from all corners of the globe had gathered near Buckingham Palace, eager to witness one of the city's most iconic traditions, the changing of the guard ceremony. The air was filled with chatter, laughter, and the occasional click of cameras as people jostled for the best view. Among the crowd stood Jake Thompson, an American traveler in his mid-30s, wearing a faded baseball cap and a leather jacket that screamed out-of-towner. Jake wasn't your typical tourist. While others came to admire the rich history and culture of London, he seemed more interested in pushing boundaries. Known among his friends back home for his bold and often reckless behavior, Jake thrived on stirring up trouble just to see what would happen. Whether it was jumping over barriers at monuments or trying to sneak into restricted areas, he always found ways to make himself the center of attention. And today, surrounded by hundreds of strangers and the stoic figures of the Royal Guards, Jake felt a familiar itch to test the limits. As the clock struck 11 o'clock a.m., the sound of marching boots echoed through the square. The guards, dressed in their striking red tunics and towering bearskin hats, moved in perfect synchronization. Their disciplined movements captivated the audience, drawing applause and admiration. Everyone watched in awe. Everyone except Jake. He leaned against a lamppost, arms crossed, smirking to himself. To him, this wasn't a display of tradition or honor. It was a challenge. How far could he push these guards before they cracked? Jake stepped closer to the barrier separating the crowd from the guards. His eyes locked onto one particular guard standing nearest to him. This guard, like the rest, stood completely still, his face expressionless, his posture rigid. It was as if he were made of stone rather than flesh and blood. Jake tilted his head, studying the man. No way he can keep this up, Jake muttered under his breath. He glanced around at the other tourists, many of whom were busy snapping photos or whispering excitedly to their companions. No one paid any attention to him, not yet, anyway. Feeling emboldened, Jake decided to act. At first, he tried small gestures to provoke a reaction. He waved his hand wildly in front of the guard's face, hoping to catch his eye. When that didn't work, he started shouting silly jokes and making exaggerated faces. "Hey, buddy, you got a license for that hat," he called out, laughing loudly at his own humor. Still, the guard didn't flinch, not even a blink. Jake's smirk faltered slightly. Was this guy even human? The longer the guard remained unresponsive, the more frustrated Jake became. Here he was, putting on a show, and no one, not the guard, not the crowd, was reacting the way he wanted. Determined not to be ignored, Jake scanned the ground until he spotted a patch of loose dirt. An idea formed in his mind, mischievous and impulsive. Without thinking twice, he bent down, scooped up a handful of dirt, and hurled it straight at the guard's face. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. The dirt hit its mark, coating the pristine uniform and leaving a streak across the guard's cheek. Gasps erupted from the crowd, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Parents covered their children's eyes, while others whipped out their phones to record the scene. Jake froze too, suddenly aware of what he'd done. For a split second, he wondered if he'd gone too far, but then he noticed something strange. Despite the dirt now clinging to his face, the guard hadn't moved a muscle, not an eyebrow raised, not a finger twitched. It was as though nothing had happened at all. And that's when Jake realized he might have just picked the wrong person to mess with. Jake's heart raced as he stood there, his hand still raised from throwing the dirt. He had expected some kind of reaction. Anger, frustration, maybe even a stern glare. But instead, the guard remained eerily still. It was unnerving. The crowd around him buzzed with shock and disapproval, but Jake couldn't tear his eyes away from the soldier in front of him. The dirt clung stubbornly to the guard's cheek, marring the otherwise flawless uniform. Yet the man didn't so much as blink. If anything, he looked like a statue carved out of marble, frozen in time. The murmurs from the onlookers grew louder. Some people whispered about how disrespectful Jake's actions were, while others debated whether the guard would break his stance or call for backup. A woman standing nearby shook her head in disgust, muttering something about zero respect. A father knelt beside his young son, explaining why what Jake had done was wrong. Even children seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, their wide eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. For Jake, the weight of everyone's judgment began to press down on him, though he tried not to show it. Determined not to let the crowd, or the guard, intimidate him, Jake doubled down on his antics. "Come on, man," he shouted, his voice tinged with both mockery and nervousness. "You're telling me you're not gonna say anything? Not even a little hey, stop that?" He gestured wildly, trying to provoke a response. But the guard's silence only deepened the tension. His unwavering composure made Jake feel smaller somehow, as if he were shrinking under the weight of the soldier's discipline. As the seconds ticked by, Jake noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. People who had initially been amused by his behavior now looked at him with disdain. Some even started recording videos on their phones, capturing every detail of the spectacle. Jake caught snippets of conversations. "Who does he think he is?" One person asked. "This isn't okay." Another replied firmly. These comments stung more than Jake cared to admit. Back home, his antics often earned him laughs and cheers. But here, surrounded by strangers who valued decorum and tradition, he felt increasingly out of place. Still, Jake refused to back down. He leaned closer to the barrier, pointing a finger at the guard. "You know what? I bet you can't last 5 more minutes without cracking," he taunted, his tone laced with false bravado. "Go ahead, prove me wrong." But the guard didn't take the bait. Instead, he continued to stand perfectly straight, his gaze fixed on a distant point as if Jake didn't exist. This level of self-control was almost surreal. Most people Jake knew would have snapped by now, yelling or shoving him away. Yet here was this stranger, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Jake's frustration bubbled over. He clenched his fists, pacing back and forth along the edge of the crowd. Why wasn't this working? Every prank, every joke, every attempt to rile someone up had always succeeded before. What made this guy different? The answer nagged at the edges of Jake's mind. Discipline. This wasn't just some random person. This was a royal guard, a symbol of duty, honor, and restraint. And no matter how hard Jake pushed, the guard wasn't going to break. For a brief moment, Jake considered giving up. Maybe he'd gone too far this time. But pride held him back. Admitting defeat in front of all these people wasn't an option. So instead, he crossed his arms and glared at the guard, silently daring him to make the first move. Little did Jake realize, the guard's next action would leave the entire crowd and the world speechless. The crowd was alive with tension, a mix of shock, disbelief, and growing anger rippling through the spectators. Some people gasped audibly, their hands flying to their mouths as they processed what had just happened. Others exchanged horrified glances, shaking their heads in disapproval. A young couple standing near the front muttered to each other about how disrespectful Jake's actions were, while an older man nearby loudly declared, "This is unacceptable." His words carried over the murmurs, drawing nods of agreement from those around him. Amidst the chaos, a few individuals stepped forward, trying to intervene. One woman, her voice firm but calm, called out to Jake, "Sir, please stop this. These men are here to serve, not to be treated like this." Her plea fell on deaf ears. Jake barely acknowledged her, too focused on his own mission to provoke a reaction from the guard. Another bystander, a middle-aged man wearing a tourist map tucked under his arm, approached cautiously. "Hey, buddy," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Maybe you should leave it alone. You've already caused enough trouble." But Jake wasn't listening. He was caught up in the moment, fueled by adrenaline and the thrill of testing boundaries. The more people criticized him, the more determined he became to push further. It was as if their disapproval only validated his behavior, making him dig his heels in deeper. He smirked at the guard again, taunting him with exaggerated gestures and sarcastic remarks. "Still nothing, huh?" he sneered. "Guess I'm not the problem here. You're just boring." Meanwhile, the crowd continued to react in waves. Parents pulled their children closer, shielding them from the spectacle, while whispering lessons about respect and decorum. Teenagers whipped out their phones, eager to capture the drama unfolding before them. Within minutes, videos of the incident began circulating online, spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. Hashtags like #booking and Palace Incident and #tourist trouble started trending almost instantly, drawing attention from people thousands of miles away. Despite the mounting pressure, the guard remained an immovable presence. His silence spoke volumes, a stark contrast to Jake's loud and chaotic energy. This dichotomy didn't go unnoticed by the crowd. Slowly but surely, the tide of public opinion shifted. While some still found Jake's antics amusing, many more sided with the guard, praising his restraint and professionalism. "Imagine having that kind of patience," one woman remarked to her friend. "I'd lose my cool in seconds." Even among the tourists, there was a shared understanding of what the royal guards represented. To many, they weren't just soldiers, they were symbols of tradition, discipline, and national pride. Watching one of them endure such blatant disrespect struck a chord with the audience, turning their initial amusement into indignation. People began calling for Jake to apologize, their voices rising above the din. "Say sorry," someone shouted. "You've gone too far," another echoed. As the commotion escalated, a security officer stationed nearby finally stepped in. Dressed in a dark uniform and carrying a radio, he moved swiftly toward Jake, his expression stern. "Sir," he said firmly, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder, "you need to step back. This behavior is unacceptable." For the first time since the incident began, Jake hesitated. The authority in the officer's voice, and the realization that he might be in real trouble, made him falter. But instead of backing down completely, Jake shrugged off the officer's grip and took a defiant step back, glaring at the guard one last time. The atmosphere remained charged, with the crowd waiting anxiously to see what would happen next. Would Jake double down on his behavior, or would he finally retreat? And how would the guard respond, if at all? As the moments stretched on, the world held its breath, captivated by the unfolding drama. Little did anyone know, the guard's next move would redefine the entire situation, leaving everyone stunned, including Jake himself. Just when it seemed like the tension couldn't grow any thicker, the guard did something that no one, least of all Jake, expected. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand to his pocket. The movement was so subtle, so controlled, that it almost went unnoticed amidst the chaos. But as soon as people realized what was happening, the entire crowd fell silent. All eyes were glued to the guard, watching every tiny motion with bated breath. From his pocket, the guard pulled out a neatly folded white handkerchief. It was pristine, untouched by dirt or wear, a stark contrast to the streak of grime now clinging to his cheek. Without hesitation, he unfolded it with careful precision, holding it delicately between his fingers. Then, maintaining his rigid posture and unwavering gaze, he brought the cloth to his face and gently wiped away the dirt. Every movement was measured, deliberate, and graceful, as if he were performing a ritual rather than cleaning up after an insult. Jake froze, his jaw slackening slightly as he watched the guard's actions. This wasn't the explosive reaction he had been hoping for. A sharp rebuke, a physical confrontation, anything to validate his antics. Instead, the guard's response was calm, composed, and utterly unexpected. There was no trace of anger in his expression, no flicker of irritation in his eyes. He simply cleaned himself off as though it were part of his duty, as natural as standing still or marching in formation. When the guard finished, he refolded the handkerchief with the same meticulous care and tucked it back into his pocket. Then, with a slight nod, not at Jake, but perhaps at the situation itself, he resumed his original stance, his chest puffed out, his chin held high, and his gaze fixed firmly ahead. He stood as though nothing had happened. In that moment, the guard became more than just a soldier. He transformed into a symbol of dignity, discipline, and quiet strength. The crowd erupted into murmurs once again. But this time, the tone had shifted entirely. Gasps of disbelief gave way to murmurs of admiration. People exchanged glances, their expressions filled with awe and respect. "Did you see that?" One woman whispered to her companion, her voice trembling with emotion. "Not even a blink. That man is incredible." Others nodded in agreement, some even applauding softly under their breath. The guard's restraint had turned the tables completely, leaving Jake looking foolish in comparison. For Jake, the weight of the moment hit him harder than he cared to admit. He had come here seeking attention, craving the thrill of provoking someone into losing their cool. But instead of getting the reaction he wanted, he found himself on the receiving end of a masterclass in self-control. The guard hadn't yelled, retaliated, or shown any sign of weakness. If anything, his actions highlighted Jake's own immaturity and lack of respect. As the reality sank in, Jake took a hesitant step backward, his bravado fading fast. For the first time since the incident began, he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. The smug grin that had plastered his face earlier was gone, replaced by a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. He glanced around at the crowd, searching for support or validation, but all he saw were disapproving stares and shaking heads. Even the security officer who had approached him earlier seemed to be giving him space, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. Meanwhile, the guard remained steadfast, his presence commanding without being overbearing. His response had not only diffused the situation, but also elevated it to something greater, a lesson in patience, professionalism, and grace under pressure. As the seconds ticked by, it became clear that this moment would linger long after the ceremony ended, etching itself into the memories of everyone who witnessed it. And somewhere in the back of Jake's mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had bitten off more than he could chew. Ask. Explain. Within minutes, the video of the incident had gone viral. Smartphones captured every detail. The smirk on Jake's face as he threw the dirt, the guard's calm reaction, and the stunned reactions of the crowd. Social media platforms buzzed with activity as users from around the world shared their thoughts. The hashtag Royal Guard Patience trended globally, accompanied by countless memes, comments, and debates. Some praised the guard's composure, calling him a real-life superhero, while others condemned Jake's behavior, labeling him disrespectful and immature. Back in the United States, Jake's family woke up to notifications flooding their phones. Friends and acquaintances tagged them in posts, asking if they knew the man causing such a stir online. At first, Jake's parents dismissed it as a misunderstanding. After all, their son was known for being loud and boisterous, but this level of recklessness seemed out of character even for him. However, as they scrolled through the footage, their hearts sank. There was no denying it. The man throwing dirt at the Royal Guard was unmistakably Jake. His mother immediately picked up the phone and dialed his number. When Jake finally answered, groggy from jet lag, her voice was sharp and unyielding. "Jake Thompson, what were you thinking?" she demanded, barely giving him a chance to respond. His father joined the call moments later, adding his own stern lecture. They reminded him of the importance of respecting other cultures and traditions, especially when traveling abroad. "You're not just representing yourself, you're representing our family and your country," his dad said firmly. "Do you realize how serious this is?" While Jake tried to brush off their concerns, claiming it was just a joke, the gravity of the situation began to dawn on him. News outlets had picked up the story, and commentators were dissecting every aspect of the incident. Headlines like "American Tourist Sparks Outrage at Buckingham Palace" dominated news feeds, painting Jake in an unfavorable light. Back home, his actions sparked heated discussions among friends and neighbors. Some defended him, saying he was simply having fun and didn't mean any harm. Others criticized him harshly, accusing him of tarnishing America's reputation abroad. The British authorities weren't far behind. Embassy officials reviewed the viral footage and decided to take action. After all, the royal guards weren't ordinary soldiers. They were protected under strict regulations designed to uphold the dignity of the monarchy. Any act of disrespect toward them could have legal consequences. By mid-afternoon, Jake received a formal summons requesting his presence at the U.S. Embassy in London. The message was clear. This wasn't going to blow over quietly. As Jake made his way to the embassy, dread settled in the pit of his stomach. He replayed the events of the morning in his mind, cringing at how reckless he had been. What started as a harmless prank had spiraled into something much bigger than he anticipated. For the first time, he realized the ripple effect of his actions, not just on himself, but on everyone watching. As he entered the embassy building, he braced himself for what was coming next. The staff greeted him with stern expressions, making it abundantly clear that they viewed his behavior as unacceptable. Inside a private meeting room, embassy officials outlined the potential ramifications of his actions. They explained that while he wouldn't face criminal charges, the incident had drawn significant attention from both the British government and the public. If similar incidents occurred in the future, they warned, the outcome might not be so lenient. They urged Jake to issue a public apology, not only to mitigate the damage but also to demonstrate accountability. For Jake, sitting there listening to the officials' words felt surreal. Just hours earlier, he had been laughing at his own antics, convinced he was untouchable. Now he found himself humbled, cornered, and forced to confront the reality of his choices. As the meeting drew to a close, one thing became painfully obvious. Apologizing wasn't just a suggestion. It was his only way forward. The following morning, Jake stood in a small conference room at the U.S. Embassy, flanked by embassy officials and facing a group of reporters. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing every nervous twitch on his face as he prepared to read a statement. The room was tense, buzzing with anticipation. For Jake, this moment felt surreal. He had never imagined that a spur-of-the-moment prank would land him here, addressing an audience of journalists and millions more watching online. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded a sheet of paper containing his apology. He cleared his throat, glanced briefly at the cameras, and began to speak. "I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am for my actions yesterday," he said, his voice wavering but sincere. "What I did was immature, disrespectful, and completely unacceptable. I didn't think about the impact it would have, not just on the Royal Guard, but on everyone who witnessed it." As he continued, Jake admitted that he had been trying to entertain himself without considering the cultural significance of the changing of the guard ceremony. "I thought I was being funny, but looking back, I see now that what I did was anything but funny," he confessed. "These guards represent tradition, discipline, and honor, things I clearly failed to respect. To the guard involved, to the British people, and to anyone offended by my behavior, I offer my sincerest apologies." The crowd listened intently, their expressions ranging from skepticism to cautious approval. Some reporters scribbled notes furiously, while others leaned forward, studying Jake's demeanor for signs of authenticity. When he finished speaking, a few hands shot up, eager to ask questions. One reporter bluntly asked if Jake believed his apology would be enough to repair the damage. Another questioned whether he truly understood the gravity of disrespecting a symbol of national pride. Jake answered each question carefully, acknowledging that words alone couldn't undo what he had done, but promising to learn from the experience. Despite his efforts, not everyone was convinced. Social media remained divided after the press conference. Supporters argued that Jake had shown courage by owning up to his mistakes, while critics dismissed his apology as insincere and self-serving. Memes mocking him continued to circulate, and hashtags like #JakeRegretsItAll gained traction alongside debates about accountability and cultural sensitivity. Back home in America, Jake's friends and family watched the coverage closely. While some praised him for stepping up and apologizing, others quietly wondered if it was too little, too late. Meanwhile, the unnamed guard who had endured Jake's antics became a global sensation overnight. People hailed him as a hero, praising his composure and professionalism under pressure. News outlets dug into his background, revealing his name, Corporal James Whittaker, and sharing stories of his dedication to duty. Photos of him standing tall during the incident went viral, accompanied by captions like "Grace Under Fire" and "The True Face of Discipline." Corporal Whittaker received messages of admiration from around the world, with many calling him an inspiration. In response to the outpouring of support, the British military issued a brief statement commending Corporal Whittaker for his exemplary conduct. They emphasized that his reaction was a testament to the rigorous training and values instilled in all Royal Guards. However, they also noted that the incident underscored the importance of respecting these traditions and the individuals tasked with upholding them. While Jake struggled to move past the backlash, Corporal Whittaker returned to his duties without fanfare. He declined interview requests, choosing instead to let his actions speak for themselves. To those who knew him, this came as no surprise. His humility and commitment to service were hallmarks of his character. Yet, even as he faded back into the background, his quiet dignity left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed the event. For Jake, the press conference marked the beginning of a long road ahead. Though he hoped his apology would help mend bridges, he knew it wouldn't erase the memories of that day or the lessons he had learned. As he stepped away from the podium, blinking under the glare of camera flashes, one thing was certain. He would never forget the man whose poise and patience had taught him the true meaning of respect. In the weeks that followed, Jake returned to the United States, carrying with him not just souvenirs from his trip, but also a heavy burden of regret. The incident at Buckingham Palace had left an indelible mark on him, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his behavior and its consequences. For the first time in his life, Jake realized that actions, no matter how small or seemingly harmless, could ripple outward, affecting people in ways he never intended. Back home, Jake found himself reflecting on the lessons he'd learned. He couldn't shake the image of Corporal James Whittaker's calm face, unwavering even in the face of provocation. That moment of restraint stuck with him, reminding him daily of how far he had strayed from decency and respect. Determined to make amends, not just for himself but for others, he began researching organizations dedicated to promoting cultural understanding and global citizenship. It wasn't long before he stumbled upon a local nonprofit called World Bridges, which focused on educating travelers about respecting different cultures and traditions. Jake reached out to the organization and offered his help, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. At first, the founders were hesitant. They weren't sure if someone like Jake, whose name was still associated with controversy, would be the right fit. But when he explained his genuine desire to turn his mistake into something positive, they agreed to give him a chance. Over time, Jake became involved in workshops and seminars, speaking candidly about what had happened at Buckingham Palace. He didn't sugarcoat his actions or try to paint himself as a victim. Instead, he openly admitted his faults, using humor and honesty to connect with audiences. His talks resonated deeply with participants, many of whom admitted they too had made mistakes while traveling. Some shared stories of unintentionally offending locals by ignoring customs, while others confessed to underestimating the importance of cultural sensitivity. Through these conversations, Jake discovered a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. Helping others avoid similar pitfalls gave him a renewed sense of direction, and slowly he began rebuilding his reputation. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Corporal James Whittaker continued his duties with quiet pride. Though he had become an international symbol of discipline and grace, he remained humble, deflecting praise whenever it came his way. When reporters occasionally approached him for interviews, he politely declined, saying simply, "I was doing my job." To him, the real heroes were the countless men and women who served alongside him, embodying the same values day in and day out. Despite his reluctance to seek the spotlight, Whittaker's actions inspired people around the world. Teachers used his story to teach students about patience and self-control, while motivational speakers cited him as an example of leadership through action rather than words. Even within the military, his conduct sparked discussions about maintaining composure in challenging situations. Though he never sought recognition, Whittaker's quiet dignity had touched lives in ways he might never fully understand. As months passed, Jake kept tabs on Whittaker's story, reading articles and watching interviews featuring colleagues and superiors who praised the guard's character. Inspired by Whittaker's humility, Jake decided to write him a personal letter. In it, he thanked the corporal, not just for handling the situation with such poise, but also for unknowingly teaching him one of the most valuable lessons of his life. He acknowledged that no apology could undo the past, but he hoped Whittaker might see his efforts to grow and change as proof of his sincerity. To Jake's surprise, he received a reply several weeks later. The note was short and modest, written in neat handwriting on plain stationery. "Thank you for your kind words," Whittaker wrote. "Mistakes are part of being human, and I'm glad to hear you've taken steps to learn from yours. I wish you all the best moving forward." Reading those lines brought tears to Jake's eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, it was acknowledgement. And for Jake, that was enough. Though their paths would likely never cross again, both men carried the memory of that fateful day with them. For Jake, it served as a reminder of where recklessness could lead, and how growth often begins with humility. For Whittaker, it reinforced the power of leading by example, showing the world that true strength lies not in retaliation, but in restraint. Together, albeit unknowingly, they had sparked a conversation about respect, accountability, and the bridges we build when we choose understanding over judgment. Months turned into a year, and the incident at Buckingham Palace gradually faded from headlines, replaced by newer stories and scandals. But its impact lingered, not just for Jake Thompson and Corporal James Whittaker, but also for the countless people who had followed their story. What started as a reckless act of provocation had transformed into something far greater, a lesson about patience, humility, and the power of grace under pressure. For Jake, life took on a new rhythm. His work with World Bridges became more than just volunteerism. It evolved into a calling. He traveled to schools, community centers, and even corporate offices, sharing his experience in candid, heartfelt talks. Each presentation began the same way. A video clip of him throwing dirt at the Royal Guard played on a screen behind him. The audience would chuckle nervously or gasp in disbelief, but Jake always smiled wryly before launching into his story. "I was that guy," he'd say, pointing to the screen. "The one you're probably judging right now. And trust me, I don't blame you." His speeches weren't polished or rehearsed. They were raw and honest, filled with self-deprecating humor and hard-earned wisdom. He spoke about how easy it is to underestimate the weight of our actions, especially when we think no one's watching. He admitted that he had once believed making noise and drawing attention was the key to being noticed. But now, he realized that real influence came from listening, learning, and respecting others. Audiences left his talks inspired, many vowing to approach travel and cultural interactions with more mindfulness. Jake's transformation didn't go unnoticed. Friends and family marveled at how much he had changed, trading his old brashness for a quieter confidence rooted in empathy. Even strangers reached out to thank him, sharing how his story had encouraged them to reflect on their own behavior. Slowly but surely, Jake shifted from being a cautionary tale to becoming a symbol of redemption, a reminder that mistakes, no matter how public, don't have to define us if we're willing to grow. As for Corporal James Whittaker, his quiet heroism continued to inspire without fanfare. Though he avoided the media spotlight, his name occasionally surfaced in conversations about leadership and discipline. Military academies included his story in training modules, emphasizing the importance of staying composed under pressure. Tourists visiting Buckingham Palace often recounted the viral incident to each other, marveling at the guards' restraint. Some even left notes of gratitude outside the palace gates, thanking Whittaker and his fellow guards for their dedication. One day, during a routine shift, Whittaker overheard a group of tourists discussing the infamous dirt-throwing incident. One woman turned to her husband and said, "Can you imagine keeping your cool like that? I wouldn't last 2 seconds." Her comment made Whittaker smile faintly beneath his bearskin hat. While he never sought recognition, knowing that his actions had resonated with so many people gave him a quiet sense of fulfillment. It reinforced what he had always believed. True strength lies not in dominance, but in dignity. Though Jake and Whittaker never met in person, their lives remained intertwined through the ripple effects of that single moment. Jake's journey toward accountability reminded everyone that growth is possible, even after our worst mistakes. Whittaker's unwavering composure showed the world that silence can speak louder than words, and that patience is a form of courage. Together, they demonstrated how opposing forces, recklessness and restraint, could create something meaningful when channeled properly. Years later, when asked about the incident, Jake would often say, "I threw dirt, but Corporal Whittaker handed me a mirror. He showed me who I was, but more importantly, he helped me see who I could become." And somewhere across the ocean, Whittaker might have smiled again, content in the knowledge that his steadfastness had sparked change, not just in one man, but in countless others who heard their story. In the end, the tale of the tourist and the royal guard wasn't just about conflict or resolution. It was about humanity. The messy, imperfect, beautiful process of learning from our missteps and striving to do better. It proved that even in moments of tension, there's always room for understanding, respect, and grace. And sometimes, all it takes is one person choosing to rise above the chaos to remind us of what truly matters.